Maximilian Hart, a billionaire known for his luxury cars and opulent lifestyle, finds himself in an unusual situation, taking a taxi for the first time in years. Everything seems ordinary until he notices a peculiar detail on the driver's hand, an old, worn-out bracelet that seems strangely familiar. What follows is a revelation that shocks Maximilian, connecting him to a past he thought was long forgotten. This unexpected encounter is about to change his life and the life of the humble taxi driver. Maximilian Hart had always lived a life of luxury. His mornings began with freshly brewed coffee served in fine china, followed by rides in one of his sleek luxury cars to his meetings in glass-walled skyscrapers. But today, nothing seemed to be going as planned. The rain had poured in torrents since early morning, and his driver was stuck in traffic miles away. With an important meeting on the horizon and no time to spare, Maximilian made an unusual decision. He flagged down a taxi. The yellow cab came to a screeching halt by the curb, splashing rainwater onto the pavement. Maximilian, wearing a tailored navy suit and his trademark polished black shoes, hesitated for just a second before he opened the door and slid into the back seat. The smell of slightly worn upholstery and the low hum of an old radio greeted him. It was different from the quiet, climate-controlled luxury he was used to, but it would have to do. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice kind, but tired. Maximilian looked up, meeting the driver's gaze through the rearview mirror. The man appeared to be in his late 50s, with gray streaks running through his dark hair and gentle lines etched on his face, evidence of years of hard work and sleepless nights. There was something about him that struck Maximilian as familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. "Downtown, the Weston Building," Maximilian replied, his tone curt but not unfriendly. The driver nodded and pulled into traffic, his eyes focused on the road ahead. Maximilian settled into his seat, his mind already drifting to the business matters waiting for him. He pulled out his phone, checking his emails, when something caught his eye. A flash of silver reflecting in the dim light of the tax. He glanced up and his gaze fell on the driver's right hand, resting casually on the steering wheel. Around the driver's wrist was a worn-out bracelet, a simple piece made of braided threads with a small silver charm. It looked old, the colors faded and the threads fraying at the ends, but it was the charm that caught Maximilian's attention. His breath caught in his throat, and he felt his heart skip a beat. He knew that bracelet. He knew it very well. It was a bracelet he hadn't seen in decades, something that belonged to a different time in his life, a time when things were simpler, when family and love were all that mattered. He remembered his mother making that bracelet, her hands skillfully braiding the colorful threads, and then tying it around the wrist of someone very dear to him. Maximilian leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto the bracelet, his heart pounding in his chest. He cleared his throat, his voice coming out softer than he intended. "That bracelet, where did you get it?" The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing slightly in confusion. He seemed taken aback by the sudden question, his hand instinctively moving to cover the bracelet. "This?" he asked, lifting his wrist slightly. "It was a gift, a long time ago." Maximilian's heart was racing now. "Who gave it to you?" He pressed, his voice more urgent. There was a strange feeling building inside him, a mix of hope, fear, and something else he couldn't quite name. The driver hesitated, his eyes flickering between Maximilian and the road ahead. "It was my sister," he said finally, his voice quiet. "She gave it to me when we were kids. I've worn it ever since." Maximilian felt his world tilt, the ground shifting beneath him. His sister. The memory came rushing back, his mother's gentle smile, her hands tying the bracelet around his younger brother's wrist, the way she had said it would keep them connected, no matter where life took them. He had been just a boy then, and his brother even younger. They had been inseparable until life had torn them apart. Maximilian had spent years searching, years wondering what had happened, where his brother had ended up, if he was even still alive. And now, here he was, sitting in the back of a taxi, looking at the wrist of a man who might just be the person he had been searching for all these years. He leaned forward, his voice trembling. What's your name?" he asked, his eyes searching the driver's face. The driver glanced at him, his brow furrowed. "It's Daniel," he said, his voice cautious. "Daniel Hart." Maximilian felt his breath catch in his throat. There was no doubt now. This was his brother. The brother he had lost. The brother he had thought he would never see again. He felt a rush of emotions: joy, disbelief, regret for all the lost years, and an overwhelming sense of hope. "Daniel," Maximilian whispered, his voice breaking. "It's me. It's Max." The car swerved slightly as Daniel turned to look at him, his eyes wide with shock. "Max?" he repeated, his voice barely audible. He pulled the taxi over to the side of the road, his hands trembling as he turned to face the man in the back seat. Maximilian nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "It's me, Danny," he said, using the nickname he hadn't spoken in decades. "I've been looking for you. I've been looking for you for so long." Daniel stared at him, his eyes filled with disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find the words. "Max, I thought..." He shook his head, his voice breaking. "I thought I'd never see you again." Maximilian reached forward, his hand resting on Daniel's shoulder. "I'm here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment the world seemed to fade away. The sounds of the city, the rain tapping against the window, the hum of the car engine, all that mattered was this moment. This connection that had been lost for so many years and was now, against all odds, found again. Tears filled Daniel's eyes as he looked at his brother, his heart swelling with emotions he had buried long ago. "Max," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I can't believe it's really you." Maximilian nodded, his own tears spilling over. "It's me, Danny. And I'm not letting you go this time." The air in the taxi was thick with emotion as the two brothers sat there, staring at each other, disbelief etched across their faces. The rain continued to beat against the windows, the outside world a blur of gray and movement. But inside the car, it felt as if time had stopped. Maximilian Hart, the billionaire who had spent his life in boardrooms and luxury cars, was now face to face with the younger brother he had thought he'd lost forever. And Daniel Hart, the humble taxi driver, was looking at a man he had only ever seen in the news. His brother, who had once been his best friend. "Max," Daniel finally managed to say, his voice hoarse, his eyes glistening with tears. "How is this possible? I thought you were gone. I thought we'd never find each other again." Maximilian took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He reached out, his hand trembling as he rested it on Daniel's shoulder. "I never stopped looking for you, Danny," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I searched everywhere. I hired people. I traveled. But it was like you vanished. I thought I'd never see you again." Daniel looked down, his hand still resting on the steering wheel, his fingers brushing over the worn bracelet. "After Mom passed," he began, his voice breaking, "things got so hard. I ended up in the system and they moved me around so much. I tried to find you too, but it was like every door I knocked on was shut. I lost hope after a while." Maximilian's heart broke at his brother's words. He had always known that the years following their mother's death had been difficult, but hearing Daniel's story, knowing how hard it must have been for him, alone in a world that seemed to have forgotten about him, was almost too much to bear. "I'm so sorry," Maximilian whispered, his voice filled with regret. "I should have tried harder. I should have found you sooner." Daniel shook his head, his eyes meeting Maximilian's, filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "It wasn't your fault, Max. We were just kids. We did the best we could." Maximilian nodded, his eyes misting over as he looked at his brother. "I'm here now," he said softly, "and I'm not going to let anything keep us apart again. Whatever it takes, I want you back in my life, Danny. I want us to be brothers again." Daniel swallowed hard, his heart swelling with emotions he had buried for so many years. The thought of reconnecting with his brother, of having family again, was something he had longed for but had convinced himself was impossible. And now here was Maximilian, offering him everything he had thought was lost. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. "Our lives, they're so different now. I'm just a taxi driver, and you're—" He gestured vaguely at Maximilian, his meaning clear. "You're a billionaire, a man who lives in a world I can't even imagine." Maximilian shook his head, his expression filled with determination. "I don't care about any of that," he said firmly. "I don't care about money or status or any of it. You're my brother, Danny. And that's all that matters to me. We've missed so much time already. I don't want to miss another day." Daniel looked at his brother, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of hope and fear swirling inside him. He had spent so many years alone, so many years thinking that he had no one left in the world. And now, here was Maximilian, the brother he had idolized, the brother who had always been there for him when they were kids, reaching out to him once more. Tears filled Daniel's eyes and he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, Max, I'd like that too. I'd like to be a part of your life again." Maximilian smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. He pulled his brother into a hug, holding him close, feeling the weight of all the lost years begin to lift. "We'll make up for all the lost time," he whispered. "I promise." The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments. Maximilian had insisted that Daniel come to his home, a sprawling estate that was a stark contrast to the small apartment where Daniel had been living. Daniel had hesitated at first, feeling out of place in the opulence of his brother's world, but Maximilian had been relentless, determined to make up for the years they had lost. Emily, Maximilian's wife, welcomed Daniel with open arms. She had heard about Maximilian's younger brother over the years, stories of their childhood, of the bond they had shared, of the heartbreaking separation that had torn them apart. Seeing them together now, she could see just how much this reunion meant to her husband. It was as if a part of Maximilian that had been missing for so long had finally been restored. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the fire crackling in the background, Emily looked at Daniel, her eyes filled with warmth. "You're part of the family now, Daniel," she said gently. "Whatever you need, we're here for you." Daniel looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had spent so many years feeling like he didn't belong anywhere, and now, here he was, sitting in his brother's home, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I don't even know how to begin to thank you both. I've never had anything like this before." Maximilian reached over, placing his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You don't need to thank us, Danny," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "We're family, and family takes care of each other." Despite the warmth and love that surrounded him, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy. He had built a life for himself, driving a taxi, living in a modest apartment, getting by one day at a time. And now, he was in this world of luxury and privilege, a world that felt foreign and overwhelming. He watched as Maximilian moved through his life with ease, managing his business, interacting with powerful people, living in a way that seemed almost unreal to Daniel. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Daniel finally voiced his fears. He looked at Maximilian, his brow furrowed. "Max, I don't know if I belong here," he said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I mean, look at you. Look at everything you've built. And then look at me. I drive a taxi. I don't know anything about this world." Maximilian turned to his brother, his expression softening. He reached out, placing his hand on Daniel's. "Danny, you belong here because you're my brother. Not because of what you do or what you have. None of that matters to me. What matters is that we're together again. And I don't want you to ever feel like you're not good enough. You are. You always have been." Daniel looked at his brother, tears welling in his eyes. He nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. I don't want to be a burden, he whispered. Maximilian shook his head, his eyes filled with love and determination. You're not a burden, Danny. You're my family, and having you here, having you back in my life means more to me than anything else. We'll figure it all out together, okay? Daniel nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Okay, he said softly. Together. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Daniel began to find his place in Maximilian's world. He started helping around the estate, getting to know the staff, and even joining Maximilian at his company, learning about the business that his brother had built from the ground up. It was a lot to take in, but with Maximilian's support, Daniel began to feel like he belonged. One day, Maximilian took Daniel to the garage, a place filled with luxury cars, each one more impressive than the last. Daniel's eyes widened as he looked around, his gaze falling on a classic car that stood out among the modern vehicles. It was an old model, one that had clearly been well cared for, and it brought back memories of their childhood, of their father, who had once driven a car just like it. Maximilian smiled as he watched his brother's reaction. I restored it, he said, his voice filled with nostalgia. It took years, but I wanted to bring a piece of our past back. I thought maybe one day I'd find you and we could drive it together, just like Dad used to. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, his eyes misting over as he looked at the car and then at his brother. Max, I don't know what to say, he whispered, his voice trembling. Maximilian walked over, placing his hand on Daniel's shoulder. How about we take it for a spin, he said, his voice filled with warmth. Just like old times. Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with love for his brother. Yeah, he said, his voice filled with emotion. I'd like that. And as they climbed into the car, the engine roaring to life, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of belonging, of connection, of family. They drove down the winding roads, the wind rushing past them, the laughter of two brothers echoing through the air. It was a moment of pure joy, a moment that made all the years of pain and separation fade away. They had found each other again, and that was all that mattered. The reunion between Maximilian and Daniel had brought joy and healing to both of their lives, but as the weeks went on, the challenges of adjusting to their new reality became more apparent. Despite the warmth and connection between the brothers, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was still an outsider in Maximilian's world. He watched as his brother navigated business meetings, mingled with the elite, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. It was a world Daniel didn't fully understand, and he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. One evening, Maximilian invited Daniel to accompany him to a charity gala, a high-profile event attended by the city's wealthiest and most influential people. Emily had encouraged Daniel to go, assuring him that it would be a wonderful opportunity for him to meet new people and see more of Maximilian's life. Daniel reluctantly agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong. The night of the gala, Daniel stood in front of the mirror in the guest room of Maximilian's mansion, adjusting the collar of the tuxedo his brother had insisted he wear. He looked at himself, feeling like an imposter. The tuxedo was perfectly tailored, the fabric expensive and luxurious, but it didn't feel like him. He sighed, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted his bow tie. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts, and Emily peeked her head inside, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. Daniel, you look wonderful, she said, her voice filled with warmth. Daniel gave her a small smile, though his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. I feel out of place, he admitted, his voice soft. I don't know if I can do this, Emily. This isn't my world. Emily stepped into the room, her expression gentle as she walked over to him. She placed her hand on his arm, her voice soothing. You're not alone, Daniel. You have Max, and you have me. We're all in this together. And besides, she added, her eyes twinkling, you're part of this world now, whether you realize it or not. You belong here just as much as anyone else. Daniel nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He followed Emily down the grand staircase, his heart pounding in his chest as he heard the distant hum of conversation from the ballroom. When they entered, the room was already filled with people. Men in tuxedos, women in glamorous gowns, the sound of laughter and clinking champagne glasses filling the air. Maximilian was standing near the entrance, greeting guests with his characteristic charm. When he saw Daniel and Emily, his face lit up with a smile. He walked over, pulling Daniel into a quick hug. "You made it," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "I'm so glad you're here." Daniel forced a smile, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that settled in his chest. "I wouldn't miss it," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. As the evening went on, Daniel found himself standing on the outskirts of conversations, feeling more and more out of place. He watched as Maximilian moved through the room with ease, shaking hands, exchanging smiles, his confidence evident in every interaction. Daniel, on the other hand, struggled to keep up with the small talk, the business jargon, the world of wealth and influence that seemed so foreign to him. At one point, Daniel found himself standing near the bar, nursing a glass of water, when a man approached him. He was older, with gray hair and a sharp suit, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked Daniel up and down. "You're Maximilian's brother, aren't you?" he asked, his voice filled with a hint of skepticism. Daniel nodded, his throat tightening. "Yes, I am," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The man raised an eyebrow, a small, condescending smile tugging at his lips. "I've heard about you. The long-lost brother, right? Must be quite the adjustment from driving a taxi to attending events like this." Daniel felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck, his fingers tightening around his glass. "It's different," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "I can imagine. Not everyone is cut out for this kind of life, you know. It takes a certain finesse. Not something you can learn behind the wheel of a cab." Daniel's heart sank, the man's words cutting into him like a knife. He had always known that he was different from his brother, that their lives had taken separate paths, that he wasn't as polished or as successful. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the disdain in the man's voice, made him feel small and out of place. Maximilian, who had been watching from across the room, noticed the exchange and made his way over, his eyes narrowing as he saw the expression on Daniel's face. He placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his gaze shifting to the older man. The man smiled, though there was no warmth in his expression. "Just making conversation," he said, his tone dismissive. He turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, his heart pounding. Maximilian looked at his brother, concern etched across his face. "What did he say to you?" he asked, his voice soft. Daniel shook his head, trying to brush it off. "It's nothing, Max," he said, though his voice trembled. "Just made me realize how different our lives are. I don't belong here." Maximilian's heart ached at his brother's words. He had hoped that bringing Daniel to the gala would help him feel included, help him see that he was part of the family, part of this world. But now, seeing the pain in Daniel's eyes, he realized that he had underestimated just how difficult it would be for his brother to adjust. "You do belong here, Danny," Maximilian said, his voice filled with conviction. "I don't care what anyone says. You're my brother, and that's all that matters. These people," he gestured vaguely to the room around them, "they don't know you. They don't know your heart, your strength. And if they can't see that, then that's their loss." Daniel looked at his brother, his eyes misting over. He nodded, though the doubt still lingered in his heart. He wanted to believe Maximilian, wanted to feel like he truly belonged, but it was hard. It was hard to shake the feeling that he was an outsider looking in, that no matter how much his brother loved him, he would never quite fit into this world. Maximilian could see the struggle in Daniel's eyes, and he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to convince him. He needed to show his brother that he belonged, that he was valued, that he was an irreplaceable part of the family, and he knew just how to do it. The next day, Maximilian called a meeting at his company. an important meeting that included his top executives, his closest advisors, and, much to everyone's surprise, his brother Daniel. Daniel walked into the boardroom, feeling out of place in the sleek, modern space, his heart pounding as he took a seat at the long table. Maximilian stood at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the room, his expression serious. He cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice calm but commanding. "I have something important to share with you all." He looked at Daniel, his eyes filled with warmth and pride. "As many of you know, my brother Daniel has recently come back into my life. It's been a journey, one filled with challenges but also with incredible joy. And today I want to make it clear that Daniel is not just my brother. He's an important part of this company and of this family." Daniel's eyes widened, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at his brother, his expression one of shock. "Max, what are you—" Maximilian held up a hand, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Just hear me out, Danny," he said gently. He turned back to the room, his voice filled with determination. "I've decided to create a new role for Daniel within the company, a role that will allow him to be involved in the day-to-day operations, to learn, to grow, and to contribute in a meaningful way. Daniel has a perspective that we need, a perspective that comes from real experience, from understanding people, from knowing what it's like to live in the real world. And I believe that he has so much to offer us." There was a moment of silence in the room, the executives exchanging glances, their expressions a mix of surprise and curiosity. Daniel, for his part, was speechless. He looked at his brother, his heart swelling with a mixture of fear, gratitude, and hope. "Max," Daniel finally managed to say, his voice trembling, "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know anything about running a company." Maximilian walked over to him, placing his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You don't have to know everything, Danny," he said softly. "We'll teach you, and I'll be with you every step of the way. I believe in you, and I know that you can do this." Daniel looked at his brother, tears welling in his eyes. He nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll try." Maximilian smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "That's all I ask, Danny. Just try. And I promise you, we'll make this work. Together." The weeks that followed were filled with challenges, but also with growth. Daniel began working at the company, learning from Maximilian, attending meetings, getting to know the people who made the business run. It was overwhelming at times, and there were moments when he doubted himself, when he felt like he was in over his head. But through it all, Maximilian was there, guiding him, supporting him, and reminding him that he wasn't alone. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Daniel and Maximilian sat together in the garden, the sun setting in the distance, casting a warm glow over the estate. Daniel looked at his brother, his heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Max," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion, "for believing in me, for giving me a chance." Maximilian smiled, his eyes misting over. "You don't need to thank me, Danny," he said. "You've earned this. You're stronger than you know, and I'm so proud of you." Daniel nodded, his heart swelling with love for his brother. He looked out at the garden, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense that he was exactly where he was meant to be. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Daniel knew that this was just the beginning, a new chapter in his life, one filled with hope, with love, and with the unbreakable bond of family. The weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, Daniel began to find his place within Maximilian's company and within his family. It wasn't always easy. There were challenges that tested his confidence, moments that made him doubt his abilities, and days when he felt overwhelmed by the weight of expectations. But every time he stumbled, Maximilian was there to catch him, to guide him, and to remind him that he wasn't alone. Maximilian had always been a natural leader. someone who could command a room with his confidence and vision. But watching his brother navigate this new world made him realize something profound. True leadership wasn't about being the smartest person in the room or having all the answers. It was about lifting others up, about helping those around you reach their full potential, and about being there for the people you cared about no matter what. One day, after a particularly challenging meeting, Daniel found himself sitting in his office, his head in his hands. The meeting had not gone well. He had stumbled over his words, struggled to keep up with the rapid-fire questions from the executives, and felt completely out of his depth. He had tried so hard, but it seemed like no matter what he did, he would never be able to fit into this world. Maximilian walked into the office, his eyes softening as he saw his brother's slumped shoulders. He closed the door behind him, walking over to the desk and sitting down across from Daniel. "Hey," he said gently, his voice filled with concern. "Rough day?" Daniel looked up, his eyes filled with frustration and defeat. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I'm cut out for this, Max. I feel like I'm constantly messing up. I'm not like you. I don't have your confidence, your knowledge. I'm just a taxi driver trying to play in a world I don't belong in." Maximilian's heart ached at his brother's words. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Daniel's, his voice filled with sincerity. "Danny, listen to me. You're not just a taxi driver, you're so much more than that. You have something that most people in this world don't. Empathy, kindness, the ability to understand people in a way that goes beyond business. That's why I wanted you here. Not because I wanted you to be like me, but because I knew that you had something special to offer." Daniel looked at his brother, tears welling in his eyes. "But what if I never get it, Max? What if I keep making mistakes?" Maximilian smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "Then you keep learning. You keep growing. Mistakes aren't failures, Danny. They're part of the process. And I'm proud of you for even trying. It takes courage to step out of your comfort zone, to take on something new, especially when it feels impossible. And you've done that. You've faced every challenge head-on, and you've shown me, and everyone else, what true strength looks like." Daniel wiped his eyes, his heart swelling with emotion. He nodded, his voice trembling. "I just don't want to let you down." Maximilian reached across the desk, placing his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You could never let me down, Danny. You're my brother and I love you. And I'm here for you no matter what." With Maximilian's support, Daniel continued to grow, both in his role at the company and in his confidence. He started to take on more responsibilities, learning the ins and outs of the business, and even began to find his own voice in meetings. It wasn't always perfect. There were still moments of doubt, still times when he felt overwhelmed. But those moments became fewer and farther between as he began to believe in himself. One day, Maximilian asked Daniel to accompany him to a meeting with a potential business partner, a local charity that they were considering supporting. It was an important meeting, one that could lead to a long-term partnership, and Maximilian wanted Daniel to see firsthand how their work could make a difference in. The meeting was held at the charity's headquarters, a modest building that provided support to families in need. As they walked through the halls, Daniel felt a sense of familiarity, a reminder of the struggles he had faced in his own life, the times when he had felt alone and uncertain. He watched as Maximilian spoke with the charity director, his voice filled with compassion and sincerity, and Daniel realized just how much his brother's work went beyond the boardroom. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He spoke from the heart, sharing his own experiences, his own journey, and the importance of giving back to those who needed it most. As he spoke, he saw the faces of the people in the room soften, their eyes filled with understanding, and he realized that he had something valuable to offer: his story, his perspective, his heart. After the meeting, Maximilian turned to his brother, his eyes filled with pride. "You were incredible in there, Danny," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "You spoke from the heart, and that's what made the difference. You connected with them in a way that I couldn't." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, his eyes misting over. I wanted them to know that I understand, that I've been there. Maximilian smiled, his heart swelling with love for his brother, and they saw that. They saw the real you, and that's why they want to work with us. You made that happen, Danny. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a sense of pride, a sense that he had made a real difference, that he had something valuable to contribute. He looked at his brother, his heart filled with gratitude. Thank you, Max, for believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Maximilian pulled his brother into a hug, his voice filled with emotion. Always, Danny. I'll always believe in you. The growth that Daniel experienced at the company also translated into his personal life. He began to feel more comfortable in his new surroundings, more at ease in the mansion that had once felt so foreign. He developed friendships with the staff, got to know Emily on a deeper level, and became an important part of Leo's life. Leo adored his Uncle Daniel, always excited to see him, always asking him to play. They would spend hours in the garden, playing games, exploring, and laughing. Daniel found joy in those moments, moments of pure, unfiltered happiness that reminded him of the innocence and wonder of childhood. One afternoon, as Daniel and Leo were playing catch in the garden, Leo looked up at his uncle, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Uncle Danny, are you going to stay with us forever?" he asked, his voice filled with innocence. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, his heart swelling with emotion. He knelt down, looking into Leo's eyes, his voice gentle. "I'll stay as long as you want me to, buddy. I'm not going anywhere." Leo smiled, throwing his arms around Daniel's neck, hugging him tightly. "Good," he said, his voice muffled against Daniel's shoulder. "I want you to stay forever." Daniel hugged him back, tears welling in his eyes. "I love you, Leo," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're my family, and I'll always be here for you." As the months went on, Daniel continued to grow, both personally and professionally. He began to take on more leadership roles at the company, gaining the respect of his colleagues and finding his own place in the business. He worked closely with Maximilian, learning from him, but also contributing his own ideas, his own vision for the future. One evening, as they sat together in Maximilian's office going over some documents, Maximilian looked at his brother, his eyes filled with pride. "You've come a long way, Danny," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I knew you could do it, but seeing it happen, it makes me so proud." Daniel looked at his brother, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Max," he said softly. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. You believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Maximilian shook his head, his eyes misting over. "You did this, Danny. You worked hard, you faced your fears, and you never gave up. I just gave you a little push. The rest, you did that on your own." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with love for his brother. He reached across the desk, taking Maximilian's hand in his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you, Max, for everything, for being my brother, for finding me, for giving me a family." Maximilian squeezed his brother's hand, his eyes filled with tears. "We're in this together, Danny. Always." And as they sat there, the warmth of the moment surrounding them, Daniel knew that he had found something truly special. He had found his place, his purpose, and his family. He had faced challenges, he had grown, and he had discovered a strength within himself that he never knew he had. He looked at his brother, his heart filled with love and gratitude, and he knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, side by side, as brothers, as family. And that was all that mattered. The Hart family had grown closer than ever. Maximilian and Daniel had not only reconnected as brothers, but had built a partnership that transcended business. It was about trust, loyalty, and the love they had always shared. Emily, Leo, and Daniel had become inseparable parts of each other's lives, and for the first time the mansion truly felt like a home filled with warmth, laughter, and purpose. However, just as everything seemed to be falling into place, an unexpected storm was brewing. one that would put everything they had built to the ah. It all began with a business opportunity, an acquisition that Maximilian's company had been pursuing for months. The acquisition was meant to expand their reach into a new market, one that was highly lucrative, but also fraught with competition. The stakes were high, and Maximilian knew that securing the deal would take everything they had. He had included Daniel in all the discussions, trusting his brother's instincts and valuing his perspective. But as they approached the final stages of the deal, a new player entered the scene, an aggressive competitor who was determined to outbid them. The competitor, a powerful conglomerate with deep pockets, had no qualms about using underhanded tactics to undermine Maximilian's efforts. They spread rumors, questioned the legitimacy of Maximilian's company, and even approached some of the key stakeholders, attempting to sway them. Maximilian was no stranger to competition. He had faced rivals before, and he knew how to fight for what he wanted. But this time it felt different. The attacks weren't just about business, they were personal. The competitor had somehow gained information about Daniel's past, his years in foster care, his struggles, his work as a taxi driver, and they used it to paint a picture of instability, insinuating that Daniel's involvement in the company was a liability. The media picked up the story, and soon headlines were plastered across newspapers and websites. Billionaire's troubled brother, is he fit to be part of the Hart Empire? The articles were filled with speculation, half-truths, and outright lies, designed to sow doubt in the minds of investors and stakeholders. Daniel's past, something he had worked so hard to move beyond, was now being used against him in the most public way imaginable. Daniel was devastated. He had spent months working to prove himself, to show that he belonged, that he was capable, and now it felt like everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. He sat in his office, staring at the headlines, his heart heavy with shame and fear. He had always known that he was different from his brother, that his life had taken a different path, but seeing his past laid bare for the world to see was almost too much to bear. Maximilian, too, was furious. He had always been fiercely protective of his family, and seeing his brother targeted in such a cruel way filled him with rage. He knew that they had to fight back, that they couldn't let their competitors' tactics succeed. But more than anything, he wanted to protect Daniel, to shield him from the pain and humiliation that came with the public scrutiny. One evening, as the storm outside mirrored the turmoil within, Maximilian found Daniel sitting in the living room, his head in his hands. He walked over, sitting down beside him, his heart aching at the sight of his brother's pain. "Danny," Maximilian said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "Look at me." Daniel lifted his head, his eyes filled with tears, his expression one of defeat. "Max, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I never wanted any of this. I never wanted to be the reason you lost everything." Maximilian shook his head, his eyes misting over. He reached out, placing his hand on Daniel's shoulder, his voice steady. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Danny. This isn't your fault. None of it is. They're trying to use your past against you because they're scared, because they know how strong we are together. And I'm not going to let them win." Daniel looked at his brother, his heart breaking. "But what if they're right? What if I don't belong here? What if I'm just dragging you down?" Maximilian's eyes hardened, his voice filled with conviction. "They are not right. You belong here, Danny. You belong here because you've earned it, because you've worked harder than anyone, because you've faced challenges that most people could never imagine, and you've come out stronger. You're my brother, and you're part of this family, and I will fight for you, no matter what." Daniel wiped his eyes, his heart swelling with a mixture of fear, gratitude, and hope. "I don't know if I can do this, Max," he whispered. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Maximilian pulled his brother into a hug, holding him close, his voice trembling with emotion. "You are strong enough, Danny, and you're not alone. We're in this together. And no matter what happens, we're going to get through it. I promise you." The days that followed were some of the most challenging that the Hart family had ever faced. The media frenzy continued, the headlines growing more sensational by the day. Investors were getting nervous, Stakeholders were beginning to question their commitment, and the deal that had once seemed so certain was now hanging by a thread. But Maximilian was determined not to back down. He called a meeting with his top executives, with Daniel by his side, and he addressed the situation head-on. He spoke with passion, with conviction, and with unwavering support for his brother. He made it clear that Daniel was an integral part of the company, that his perspective, his experience, and his heart were what made their company strong. He challenged the executives to look beyond the headlines, to see the person that Daniel truly was, and to recognize the value he brought to the table. Daniel, too, spoke at the meeting. It took every ounce of courage he had, but he stood before the room of executives, his voice steady, his eyes filled with determination. He shared his story, his journey, his struggles, and the lessons he had learned along the way. He spoke of the values that his mother had instilled in him and Maximilian, the importance of family, of resilience, of never giving up, no matter how difficult things got. When Daniel finished speaking, there was a moment of silence in the room. Then one by one the executives began to nod, their expressions softening, their respect for Daniel evident. They saw the strength in him, the authenticity, the heart that had driven him to overcome so much. And they knew that Maximilian was right. Daniel was exactly where he belonged. With the support of the company behind them, Maximilian and Daniel turned their attention to the deal. They worked tirelessly, meeting with stakeholders, addressing their concerns and reassuring them of the company's stability and vision for the future. They were honest about the challenges they faced, but they were also clear about their commitment to moving forward, together as a family, as a team. Emily, too, played a crucial role. She reached out to the community, organizing events to support the charity they had partnered with, showing the world that the Hart family was more than just a business. They were a force for good, dedicated to making a positive impact on the lives of others. She spoke to the media, sharing stories of Daniel's contributions, of his kindness, his generosity, and the difference he had made in the lives of so many. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. The negative headlines were replaced by stories of resilience, of brotherhood, of a family that refused to be torn apart. The public began to see Daniel not as a liability, but as an inspiration, someone who had faced adversity and come out stronger, someone who embodied the values that the Hart family stood for. And then, finally, the day came. The deal that had seemed all but lost was back on the table, the stakeholders having renewed their commitment to Maximilian's company. The acquisition was finalized, and the Hart family emerged from the storm stronger, more united, and more determined than ever. That evening, as the sun set over the mansion, the family gathered in the garden, the air filled with a sense of peace and triumph. Leo ran through the grass, his laughter echoing through the garden, while Emily and Daniel sat on a blanket beneath the old oak tree. Maximilian stood nearby, watching his family, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. He walked over to where Daniel was sitting, his eyes misting over as he looked at his brother. He reached down, pulling Daniel to his feet, his voice filled with emotion. "We did it, Danny," he said, his voice trembling. "We made it through." Daniel nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, Max," he whispered. "I was ready to give up. But you never gave up on me." Maximilian pulled his brother into a hug, holding him close. "I'll never give up on you, Danny. You're my brother. And no matter what, we're in this together." Emily joined them, wrapping her arms around both of them, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "We're a family," she said softly, "and nothing can ever change that." Leo ran over, his eyes wide with excitement, his voice filled with innocence. "What's happening?" he asked, looking up at his parents and his uncle. Maximilian smiled, reaching down to lift his son into his arms. He looked at Emily, then at Daniel, his heart swelling with love. "We're celebrating, little one," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "Because we're together, and because we're stronger than ever." Leo smiled, wrapping his arms around his father's neck, his heart filled with happiness. "I love you, Daddy. I love you, Mommy. I love you, Uncle Danny." Daniel felt his heart swell, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his nephew. "I love you too, Leo," he whispered, his voice trembling, "more than anything." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the garden, the Hart family stood together, their hearts full, their spirits unbroken. They had faced challenges, they had fought for each other, and they had come out stronger on the other side. They were a family bound by love, by resilience, and by an unbreakable bond that nothing and no one could ever take away. The days that followed the successful acquisition were filled with a sense of triumph and renewal. The Hart family had faced the storm and come out the other side stronger than ever, their bond solidified by the trials they had endured together. The once solitary mansion was now a home, a place where love, laughter, and the warmth of family filled every corner. Maximilian felt a profound sense of gratitude as he walked through the halls of the mansion. He had built his life on ambition, on striving for success, on proving himself in the world of business. But through reconnecting with Daniel, he had come to understand that true success wasn't about the money he made or the deals he closed. It was about the people he loved, the relationships he nurtured, and the family he had built. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the estate, Maximilian found himself in the garden, standing beneath the old oak tree that had become a symbol of their resilience. The air was cool, the scent of blooming flowers carried on the gentle breeze, and the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted from the house. Maximilian looked up at the sky, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the twilight, and he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. He heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Emily walking toward him, her smile radiant as she came to stand by his side. She slipped her hand into his, her fingers intertwining with his, her voice soft. "It's beautiful tonight," she said, her gaze following his to the sky above. Maximilian nodded, his heart swelling with love for his wife. "It is," he agreed, his voice filled with warmth. He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you, Emily, for everything, for believing in me, for standing by me, for loving me." Emily smiled, her eyes misting over as she looked at her husband. She reached up, cupping his cheek, her voice filled with tenderness. "I love you, Max, and I always will, no matter what." Maximilian leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a gentle kiss, his heart swelling with love for the woman who had been his partner through it all. He pulled back, his gaze locking onto hers, and he smiled. "We've come a long way," he said softly, "and I know that whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Emily nodded, her heart filled with hope for the future. "Together," she whispered. Inside the mansion, Daniel sat with Leo on the living room floor, the two of them surrounded by toy cars, blocks, and the remnants of an elaborate cityscape they had built together. Leo's laughter filled the room as he zoomed a toy car along the imaginary streets, his eyes wide with excitement. Daniel watched his nephew, his heart swelling with love. Leo had become such an important part of his life, an innocent, joyful reminder of all the goodness that still existed in the world. The bond they shared was something Daniel cherished, and every day, he found himself more and more grateful for the second chance he had been given. Leo looked up at his uncle, his eyes bright. "Uncle Danny, can we build a tower next?" he asked, his voice filled with excitement. Daniel smiled, nodding as he reached for the blocks. "Of course, buddy," he said, his voice gentle. "We can build the biggest tower ever." Leo grinned, his face lighting up as he reached for the blocks, his small hands working diligently to stack them higher and higher. Daniel watched, his heart swelling with pride as he helped Leo add piece after piece, the two of them laughing together when the tower inevitably toppled over. Emily and Maximilian walked into the room, their hearts swelling at the sight of Daniel and Leo sitting on the floor, surrounded by toys, their laughter filling the air. Maximilian walked over, kneeling beside his son, his eyes filled with warmth. "What are you two up to?" Maximilian asked, his voice playful. Leo looked up at his father, his eyes wide with excitement. "We're building a tower, Daddy," he exclaimed, his voice filled with pride. But it keeps falling over. Maximilian chuckled, reaching for a block and adding it to the growing pile. Maybe I can help, he said, his eyes meeting Daniel's, a smile playing at his lips. Daniel nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude as he looked at his brother. I think we could use all the help we can get, he said, his voice filled with warmth. Emily sat down beside them, her smile radiant as she watched her family working together. She looked at Maximilian, her heart swelling with love for the man who had grown so much over the past year, the man who had opened his heart, who had allowed himself to be vulnerable, and who had embraced the love of his family with open arms. They spent the rest of the evening building towers, playing games, and sharing stories. The laughter, the warmth, the sense of togetherness, it was everything they had fought for, everything they had dreamed of, and more. The challenges they had faced had brought them closer, had strengthened the bonds between them, and had shown them the true meaning of family. Months later, the Hart family gathered once more in the garden, this time for a celebration. The charity they had partnered with had achieved incredible milestones, and they were hosting a gathering to honor the work that had been done and the lives that had been changed. The garden was beautifully decorated, the air filled with the scent of flowers, the soft glow of lanterns hanging from the trees. Daniel stood beside Maximilian, his heart swelling with pride as he looked around at the people gathered in the garden, the families who had been helped, the children who were now thriving, the volunteers who had given so much of themselves. He looked at his brother, his voice filled with emotion. Look at what you've done, Max, he said softly. Look at all the lives you've touched. Maximilian shook his head, his eyes misting over. It's not just me, Danny, he said, his voice trembling. This was all of us. You, Emily, Leo, everyone. We did this together. Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with love for his brother. I'm proud of you, Max, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I'm so grateful to be a part of this, to be a part of your life, of this family. Maximilian pulled his brother into a hug, holding him close, his voice filled with emotion. You are my family, Danny, and you always will be, no matter what. Emily joined them, her eyes filled with tears as she wrapped her arms around both of them. We're a family, she whispered, her voice trembling, and nothing will ever change that. Leo ran over, his eyes wide with excitement as he looked up at his parents and his uncle. What's happening? He asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Maximilian smiled, lifting his son into his arms, his heart swelling with love. We're just having a family moment, little one, he said, his voice filled with warmth. Because we're together. And that's all that matters. Leo grinned, wrapping his arms around his father's neck, his heart filled with happiness. I love you, Daddy. I love you, Mommy. I love you, Uncle Danny. Daniel felt tears well up in his eyes as he looked at his nephew, his heart swelling with love. I love you too, Leo, he whispered, his voice trembling, more than anything. As the evening wore on, the garden was filled with laughter, conversation, and the warmth of love. The stars twinkled above, casting a gentle glow over the estate, and the air was filled with a sense of peace and fulfillment. The Hart family had faced challenges that had tested them to their core, but they had come out the other side stronger, more united, and more in love than ever. Maximilian looked around at his family, at Emily, at Daniel, at Leo, and he felt a sense of pride, of gratitude, of hope. He had spent so many years chasing success, believing that his worth was tied to his accomplishments, to his wealth, to the power he wielded. But now he knew that true success was measured in love, in the moments shared with the people who mattered most, in the bonds that could never be broken. He reached for Emily's hand, his eyes locking onto hers, his voice filled with emotion. We've come a long way, he said softly, and I know that whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Emily smiled, her eyes misting over as she looked at her husband, her heart swelling with love. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Together. she whispered. And as they stood beneath the old oak tree, surrounded by the people they loved, Maximilian knew that they had found something truly special. They had faced the storms, they had grown, and they had built a life filled with love, laughter, and hope. They were a family bound by an unbreakable bond, and no matter what the future held, they would face it together, side by side, with love, with courage, and with the knowledge that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Years had passed since the Hart family had faced the challenges that once tested their unity and love. The sprawling mansion, once a symbol of luxury and solitude, had transformed into a living testament to growth, resilience, and the bonds of family. Its halls were filled with laughter, its rooms bustling with activity, and its garden thriving under the care of those who now called it home. What had once been a house built for success had truly become a home filled with love. Leo, now 10 years old, had grown into an intelligent, kind-hearted boy who embodied the best qualities of his parents and his uncle. He had inherited Maximilian's determination, Emily's warmth, and Daniel's empathy. Leo had an endless curiosity about the world around him, always asking questions, always eager to learn and grow. He loved helping his Uncle Daniel with community projects, visiting the charity they supported, and understanding what it meant to give back to those in need. The family had continued their work with the charity, expanding their support to reach more families, more children who needed the love and care they could offer. Daniel had become an essential part of this mission. His past experiences, his own struggles, making him uniquely capable of connecting with those they helped. He had grown into a leader within the organization, taking on responsibilities that brought him fulfillment and a sense of purpose. One late afternoon, Daniel and Leo walked through the charity's community center, their footsteps echoing in the hallway. The walls were decorated with colorful paintings created by the children who attended the center, images of hope, of joy, of dreams that seemed within reach. Leo looked up at his uncle, his eyes wide with admiration. "Uncle Danny," Leo began, his voice filled with curiosity, "how did you know you wanted to do this? To help people like this?" Daniel paused, his eyes softening as he looked at his nephew. He knelt down, placing his hands on Leo's shoulders, his voice gentle. "I guess I always knew deep down," he said softly. "When I was younger, I didn't have much. There were times when I felt lost, alone. But I remember the people who helped me, the ones who made me feel seen, who gave me hope. And I wanted to be that person for someone else, to make sure that no one feels alone like I did." Leo nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. He looked around at the community center, at the children playing, laughing, and he smiled. "You're really good at it, Uncle Danny," he said earnestly. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Daniel felt his heart swell with emotion, his eyes misting over. He pulled Leo into a hug, his voice trembling. "You're already an incredible person, Leo," he whispered. "And I know you're going to do amazing things. Just keep being you. That's all anyone could ask for." Leo hugged his uncle tightly, his heart filled with love and admiration. "I will, Uncle Danny," he whispered. "I promise." Back at the mansion, Maximilian and Emily were sitting in the garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the estate. The old oak tree, now even more majestic, stood tall, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Emily looked at Maximilian, her eyes filled with warmth as she reached for his hand. "Do you remember the first time we sat here like this?" she asked, her voice filled with nostalgia. Maximilian smiled, his gaze drifting to the oak tree, memories flooding his mind. "I do," he said softly. "It was just after Daniel came back into our lives. I remember sitting here thinking about everything we had been through, about how much had changed. And I remember feeling, for the first time in a long time, that everything was going to be okay." Emily nodded, her heart swelling with love for her husband. She leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've come such a long way, Max, and I wouldn't trade any of it for the world." Maximilian turned to look at his wife, his eyes misting over. He reached up, cupping her cheek, his voice filled with emotion. "Neither would I, Emily," You're my heart, my anchor, and I love you more than anything." Emily smiled, tears welling in her eyes. She leaned in, pressing her lips to his, her heart swelling with gratitude for the life they had built together. When she pulled back, she looked at him, her eyes filled with hope. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together, just like we always have." Maximilian nodded, his heart full. "Together," he whispered. That evening, the family gathered in the garden for dinner, an informal celebration of everything they had achieved, of the love that bound them together. The table was set beneath the oak tree, adorned with candles that flickered in the gentle breeze, their soft glow illuminating the faces of those gathered. Daniel sat beside Maximilian, his heart swelling as he looked around at his family. Leo was telling a story, his eyes wide with excitement, his hands gesturing animatedly as he described his latest adventure. Emily laughed, her gaze filled with warmth as she listened to her son, her hand resting on Maximilian's. Maximilian looked at his brother, his eyes filled with pride. He reached over, placing his hand on Daniel's shoulder, his voice soft. "You've come so far, Danny," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, and I know Mom would be too." Daniel felt tears well up in his eyes, his heart swelling with love for his brother. He nodded, his voice trembling. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Max. You gave me a chance. You believed in me, and you gave me a family when I thought I had no one. I'll never be able to thank you enough." Maximilian shook his head, his eyes misting over. "You don't need to thank me, Danny. We're family, and family takes care of each other always." Leo looked over at his father and uncle, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you guys crying?" he asked, his voice filled with innocence. Maximilian chuckled, wiping his eyes as he looked at his son. "Maybe just a little, buddy," he admitted, his voice filled with warmth. Leo grinned, his face lighting up. "It's okay, Daddy. Uncle Danny always says it's okay to cry if you're happy." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with love for his nephew. He nodded, his voice soft. "That's right, Leo. Sometimes tears are just a way of showing how much we care." Emily reached for her husband's hand, her eyes misting over as she looked at her family. "We have so much to be grateful for," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "And I wouldn't trade any of it for the world." Maximilian nodded, his heart full as he looked around at the people he loved. "Neither would I," he whispered. And as they sat beneath the old oak tree, surrounded by the warmth of love, the laughter of children, and the promise of a future filled with hope, Maximilian knew that they had found something truly special. They had faced the challenges that life had thrown at them, they had grown, and they had built a family that was filled with love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of togetherness. This was their legacy, not the wealth, not the power, not the success. Their legacy was the love they had shared, the lives they had touched, and the family they had built together. And as the stars twinkled above, casting their gentle light over the garden, Maximilian knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, side by side, with love, with courage, and with the knowledge that they were exactly where they were meant to be. They were the Hart family, and nothing would ever change that.